Gotham had taught Bane everything it could. Its alleys, prisons, and institutions had once forged him into something sharper than the city itself. But now they no longer resisted him. Gotham's criminals were predictable, its systems brittle, its heroes bound by rules that made victory inevitable if one possessed enough patience. Bane had broken the bat, broken the city, and broken its illusions of order. What remained was stagnation. Strength without challenge rotted, and Bane despised rot more than chaos. The moment reality tore him from Gotham was not dramatic in the way stories preferred. There was no thunder, no warning, no cosmic voice announcing destiny. One breath he was standing within the skeletal remains of a forgotten industrial complex, contemplating a future that no longer demanded his attention. And the next the world folded inward. Pressure crushed his senses, not pain but compression, as if existence itself were being wrung dry. The venom in his system surged instinctively, his body responding to threat before his mind could form questions. When the pressure released, heat replaced cold concrete. The air was thick, wet, heavy with salt and rot. Sounds reached him first, distant gunfire, engines straining under load, voices shouting in languages that carried sharp edges and desperation. Bane opened his eyes to a skyline unlike Gotham's rigid towers. This city sprawled outward rather than upward, rusted metal and concrete stacked without symmetry, glowing with cheap neon that reflected off puddles of stagnant water. Roanapur did not announce itself. It did not posture or threaten. It simply existed, unapologetically violent and alive. Bane rose slowly, scanning his surroundings with methodical precision. The industrial dockyard he now occupied was alive with movement. Men loaded crates onto ships without insignia, weapons slung casually, as if they were tools rather than instruments of death. No uniforms, no authority symbols, no police presence. Yet there was order here, not the institutional kind, but something more primal. Everyone knew where they stood, and everyone knew the consequences of stepping out of line. That intrigued him. In Gotham, chaos wore costumes and hid behind ideology. In Roanapur, chaos wore no mask. Violence was transactional, honest in its cruelty. Bane could respect that, but respect did not mean acceptance. He watched as a disagreement over cargo escalated into a beating so swift and brutal it ended without witnesses intervening. The men returned to their work moments later, as if nothing had happened. No outrage, no panic, no escalation, just efficiency. A city that consumed its weak without ceremony. Bane moved through the streets as night deepened, his imposing frame drawing glances, but no immediate challenges. Roanapur was used to monsters. Size alone did not inspire fear here. Reputation did. He noted how people reacted not to presence, but to confidence. Those who walked like prey were hunted. Those who moved with certainty were left alone unless someone higher on the invisible hierarchy decided otherwise. This was not a city governed by impulse. It was governed by unspoken rules enforced through reputation and memory. Every alley told a story. Every scar was a resume. Bane absorbed it all, cataloging behaviors, responses, patterns. This was not Gotham's chaotic theater. This was a pressure cooker, where violence was refined into culture. By the time he reached the heart of the city, Bane understood something crucial. Roanapur did not fear collapse, because collapse was its foundation. There was no illusion of stability to protect, no civic identity to shatter. The city survived because no one believed it could be saved. That belief allowed every faction to coexist in a perpetual stalemate, each too wary of the consequences to overreach. That equilibrium disgusted him. Stagnation masquerading as freedom was still stagnation. Roanapur mistook endless conflict for strength. But strength without direction was weakness in disguise. Bane saw a city that refused to evolve because evolution required sacrifice, and sacrifice required someone strong enough to demand it. He did not announce himself. That would have been foolish. Instead, he observed how information moved. Money flowed faster than blood here, and blood flowed faster than loyalty. He learned which ports mattered, which bars served as informal courts, which gunmen were professionals, and which were desperate. He listened more than he spoke, and when he did speak, he chose moments that established presence without inviting challenge. In a city like Roanapur, legends were not born through spectacle. They were born through consistency. By dawn, Bane had already decided that this city would either break him or be remade by him. There was no middle ground. He did not need Gotham symbols here. No mask, no theatrics. Only results mattered. Roanapur respected nothing else. As the sun rose over rusted cranes and oil-stained water, Bane felt something he had not experienced in years. Anticipation. This world did not know him. It did not care about his past victories or the legends he carried. That anonymity was not an insult. It was an opportunity. Roanapur believed itself immune to conquest because it devoured conquerors. It believed chaos was its shield, unpredictability its armor. Bane understood shields and armor better than most. He also understood how to break them. This city would not fall in a night. It would resist, adapt, and retaliate. That was good. A city worth ruling had to fight for its existence. Bane welcomed that struggle, because only through conflict could something stronger emerge. As traffic resumed and the city pretended morning changed anything, Bane stepped fully into Roanapur streets. Not as a visitor, not as a mercenary, as a test. And Roanapur, unknowingly, had just accepted it. Roanapur did not respond to intrusion with curiosity. It responded with testing. By the second night, Bane understood that the city had noticed him, even if it had not yet decided what he was. Eyes followed him more openly now. Conversations paused when he entered certain bars. Information moved faster than bullets in Roanapur, and his size, discipline, and refusal to posture had already marked him as something that did not fit any known category. The first probe came quietly. A trio of armed men approached him near the riverfront, their movements casual, almost lazy, but their spacing precise. Professionals, not street trash. They did not threaten him. They did not insult him. One simply asked who he worked for and why he had not checked in with anyone who mattered. It was not a question meant to be answered honestly. It was bait, designed to reveal insecurity or arrogance. Bane answered neither way. He stepped closer instead, invading their space without touching them, forcing them to react. Their hands twitched toward their weapons. He smiled beneath his mask, not from amusement, but confirmation. They were measuring him, and he was measuring them back. When he spoke, his voice was calm, controlled, and utterly devoid of apology. He told them he belonged to no syndicate, owed no one respect, and was not interested in employment. If they needed to categorize him, they could call him a problem and decide whether they wanted it now or later. They chose later. Smart men often did. Word spread after that encounter, not through shouting but whispers. A foreigner. Strong. Disciplined. Not stupid. Possibly unstable. Possibly useful. Those were the most dangerous words in Roanapur. Useful people attracted attention, and attention attracted blood. Bane welcomed neither, but he understood both were inevitable. He began to see the city's structure more clearly now. Roanapur was not ruled by a single power, but balanced between several, each tolerating the others, because annihilation would cost more than coexistence. Crime families, mercenary crews, arms dealers, smugglers, and freelance killers all occupied overlapping territories, enforcing their influence through reputation rather than borders. The city functioned because no one believed total control was possible. That belief was the city's greatest weakness. Bane observed how violence escalated here. It was rarely personal. It was transactional. Someone failed to deliver. Someone crossed an invisible line. Someone became inconvenient. Death followed not as punishment, but as correction. Gotham's violence had been emotional, symbolic, theatrical. Roanapur's was efficient. That efficiency impressed him, but it also limited the city's imagination. No one aimed higher than survival. No one dared to reshape the system because the system rewarded those who knew their place. Bane had never accepted his place. He tested Roanapur next, not with force, but disruption. A shipment vanished overnight, not stolen, simply redirected and returned 2 days later untouched, accompanied by a message that offered no explanation and demanded no payment. The gesture confused everyone involved. It established capability without motive, and in Roanapur, unpredictability was more terrifying than aggression. The response was swift. A meeting was arranged without invitation. Bane arrived unarmed by Roanapur standards, which meant he carried no visible weapons. The room was filled with people who did not sit unless they trusted the chair. Guns were present, but not raised. Everyone was pretending this was negotiation rather than reconnaissance. They asked him what he wanted. Bane answered honestly. He wanted to understand how Roanapur survived without collapsing into civil war. He wanted to know why a city built on violence refused to evolve beyond it. He wanted to know who decided which lives were expendable and which were protected. The room did not like those questions, not because they were dangerous, but because they were foundational. Asking them implied the system itself was on trial. Someone laughed nervously. Someone else suggested he leave the city before curiosity became a liability. Bane listened, nodded, and then explained something in return. He explained that systems built on fear inevitably ossified, that leaders who relied on balance rather than dominance eventually lost both, that Roanapur was not strong because it endured chaos, but weak because it worshipped it. No one disagreed aloud. They did not need to. They simply marked him. After that night, Roanapur stopped testing Bane indirectly. The city began pushing back more openly. Deals he interfered with turned violent. People who spoke to him were questioned. A bounty circulated quietly, not for his death, but for information. Someone wanted to know what he really was before deciding how to deal with him. Bane did not rush. He allowed pressure to build. He wanted Roanapur to exhaust its assumptions before he shattered them. He let rumors mutate. Some claimed he was an ex-soldier. Others said a cartel experiment gone wrong. A few whispered he was building something, though no one could say what. Fear grew not from certainty, but from absence of it. When violence finally came, it was decisive and unmistakable. An ambush in a narrow street, coordinated, heavy fire. No civilians nearby. This was not intimidation. This was execution. Bane welcomed it. The city had chosen escalation, and escalation revealed truth faster than dialogue ever could. The fight was brief and brutal. Roanapur's killers were skilled, but they were used to targets that bled normally, panicked appropriately, and died when overwhelmed. Bane did none of those things. He advanced through gunfire with calculated brutality, breaking bodies with precision rather than rage. When it ended, the street was silent except for labored breathing and distant engines. He left survivors intentionally. By morning, Roanapur understood something it had not before. This man was not merely dangerous. He was inevitable. He did not kill for pleasure, territory, or pride. He killed to demonstrate consequence. That distinction mattered. It meant negotiations would no longer revolve around profit, but survival. Bane stood on a rooftop overlooking the city as dawn bled across the skyline. Roanapur was stirring, already adapting, already recalculating. It always did. But this time, the calculus had changed. The city was no longer deciding whether to engage him. It was deciding how to endure him. And Bane, watching it writhe beneath its own weight, understood that Roanapur had finally given him what Gotham no longer could. Resistance worthy of purpose. This city would fight him. It would conspire, betray, and escalate until either it broke him or he broke it. That struggle would define what Roanapur became next. For the first time since his arrival, Bane allowed himself certainty. The city had noticed him. Roanapur did not sleep after the ambush. It never truly did. But this time the city's restlessness carried a sharper edge. A collective awareness that something fundamental had shifted. Information flowed through back channels, whispered over cheap liquor and encrypted radios, stitched together by fear rather than curiosity. Survivors of the failed hit told their stories in fragments. each version stripped of bravado, each detail reinforcing the same conclusion. This man was not reckless. He was not lucky. He was methodical, disciplined, and terrifyingly patient. Bane had crossed an invisible threshold. He was no longer an anomaly to be assessed. He was a variable that demanded restructuring. Within days, Roanapur's power brokers reacted in ways that reflected their nature. Some pulled back, fortifying territory and cutting losses, hoping distance would buy safety. Others leaned forward, convinced that anyone who could not be controlled must be eliminated before their presence destabilized the entire ecosystem. A few, the most dangerous, began to wonder how such a force could be pointed at their rivals. The city's fragile balance began to tilt. Bane watched this unfold from the margins, learning not from what people said, but from what they stopped doing. Smuggling routes altered. Arms shipments arrived with heavier escorts. Certain bars went quiet, while others grew crowded with mercenaries. He mapped these changes mentally, identifying who feared him, who hated him, and who believed they could use him. Each reaction revealed hierarchy, ambition, and weakness more clearly than any interrogation could. He understood now that Roanapur's greatest strength, its decentralization, was also its flaw. No single leader meant no unified response. Fear spread unevenly, causing overreactions in some quarters and paralysis in others. That fragmentation was an opening, but Bane did not exploit it yet. He wanted the city to choose its own path toward collapse or evolution. The first major fracture appeared between the syndicates that relied on stability and those that thrived on chaos. The former saw Bane as an existential threat. The latter saw opportunity. Meetings grew tense. Old alliances strained. Accusations flew quietly, never in public, but always with hands near weapons. Roanapur's leaders had survived by avoiding absolutes. Bane represented one. He became a subject of obsession. People speculated about his limits, his motivations, his past. Some attempted to trace his origins, digging through ports, flight logs, mercenary registries, anything that could explain where a man like this came from. They found nothing. That absence unnerved them more than any criminal record could have. Roanapur was used to ghosts, but not ones that reshaped the living. Bane, meanwhile, began to apply pressure with intention. He did not attack randomly. He targeted nodes. A broker who specialized in exploiting trafficked children found his warehouses dismantled overnight, his guards incapacitated, his ledgers left behind for rivals to find. A mercenary outfit known for massacres disguised as clean hits lost its command structure in a single night, leaders removed without spectacle, their absence louder than gunfire. These actions sent conflicting messages. To some, Bane appeared moral, selectively violent, almost principled. To others, he was unpredictable, enforcing a personal code no one else understood. Both interpretations were dangerous. They encouraged debate rather than unity, and debate in Roanapur often ended in blood. The city began to whisper a new question. Not who is he, but what does he want Roanapur to become? That question terrified those in power more than the prospect of death. Change threatened profit. Reform threatened relevance. And Bane's silence on his endgame forced everyone else to project their worst fears onto him. Some believed he intended to rule. Others thought he was tearing the city down to build something purer in its place. A few suspected he was simply testing himself against a system built on cruelty. All of them underestimated him in different ways. Bane understood that fear alone could not reshape Roanapur. Fear created obedience, not transformation. The city had lived with terror for decades and adapted beautifully. To truly change it, he needed to fracture its belief in inevitability. He needed people to see that Roanapur was not eternal, not immutable, not the only way to survive. He chose his next move carefully. Rather than strike another criminal faction, Bane intervened in a conflict that should have resolved itself quietly. A turf war between two mid-level groups escalated beyond profit into spite, threatening civilians who existed outside the city's unspoken rules. Normally, this would have been tolerated. Collateral damage was the cost of doing business. This time, Bane stepped in openly. He walked into the conflict zone in broad daylight, unmasked, unconcerned with witnesses. Gunfire erupted almost immediately. It ended minutes later. Bane dismantled both sides with equal severity, leaving their leadership incapacitated and their operations exposed. Then he did something unprecedented. He spoke. Not a speech. A statement. He told the survivors that Roanapur could continue as it always had, devouring itself in cycles of petty violence, or it could adapt. He made no threats, offered no protection, demanded no allegiance. He simply declared that he would no longer tolerate systems that thrived solely on indiscriminate suffering. Anyone who disagreed was free to test him. The city listened. That single act sent shockwaves through Roanapur's underworld. For the first time, violence had been framed not as transaction, but as philosophy. Bane had articulated a challenge to the city's identity. He was not asking to be king. He was questioning whether kings were necessary at all. Reactions were swift and polarized. Some saw him as a tyrant in the making, imposing his morality through force. Others saw the possibility of order without exploitation, a radical thought in a place that treated both as synonymous. Younger operators, those who had risen through blood rather than inheritance, were especially attentive. They had less to lose and more to gain from upheaval. Older powers were less contemplative. They began coordinating in earnest. A coalition formed quietly, composed of figures who rarely shared a room unless profit demanded it. Their goal was simple: end Bane before his idea spread. Not because he threatened their lives directly, but because he threatened the narrative that kept Roanapur functioning. They pooled resources, intelligence, and killers, preparing an operation designed not just to kill him, but to erase him symbolically. Bane anticipated this. He had been waiting for it. He allowed their plans to progress, feeding them just enough success to encourage confidence. A near miss here. A compromised contact there. Each concession sharpened their resolve. When the trap finally closed, it was massive, overwhelming, and designed to make a statement. Multiple teams, layered contingencies, heavy firepower, and a public setting meant to broadcast dominance. Bane walked into it knowingly. The battle that followed was not just physical. It was psychological warfare played out in real time. Bane absorbed punishment meant to break lesser men, using pain as data rather than deterrent. He dismantled the coalition's forces systematically, turning their coordination against them, forcing leaders to watch their carefully constructed plan collapse into chaos. But this time, he did not simply win. He captured. Key figures were taken alive, stripped of authority, and exposed. Their secrets were leaked strategically, not to law enforcement, which meant nothing in Roanapur, but to rivals and subordinates. Trust evaporated overnight. Entire networks imploded under the weight of betrayal and paranoia. By morning, Roanapur's power structure was irreparably damaged. The city did not collapse, but it staggered. Long-standing hierarchies dissolved. Vacuums formed where fear had once enforced loyalty. In those gaps, new players emerged, emboldened by the realization that the old rules were not invincible. Bane had not crowned himself ruler, but he had shattered the illusion that no one else could reshape the city. From a high vantage point overlooking the port, Bane surveyed the aftermath. Fires burned in controlled places. Violence flared sporadically, but without cohesion. Roanapur was wounded, not dead. It was changing whether it wanted to or not. He felt no satisfaction. This was not victory. It was phase 1. The city had responded to him with force, then fear, then ideology. Each step had revealed deeper truths about its nature. Now came the most dangerous stage: adaptation. Roanapur would attempt to evolve around him, incorporating his presence into its mythology, reframing him as anomaly rather than catalyst. Bane would not allow that. If Roanapur was to survive what he represented, it would have to confront its own foundations, not simply reinforce them. The next stage would test not just the city's capacity for violence, but its willingness to imagine something beyond it. And that, Bane knew, would provoke resistance far more ruthless than gunfire. Roanapur's attempts at adaptation were subtle at first, almost polite. New rules were not announced, they were implied. Certain forms of violence quietly declined while others surged, redirected like a river forced through narrower channels. Brokers began vetting clients more carefully. Mercenary outfits adjusted engagement protocols, favoring distance and overwhelming force over bravado. Even the street-level operators felt the shift, sensing that recklessness no longer paid the dividends it once had. The city was learning, and that alone made it dangerous. Bane recognized the pattern immediately. Roanapur was not trying to defeat him. It was trying to absorb him. This was how the city had survived countless invaders, reformers, and would-be conquerors. It did not resist head-on unless necessary. Instead, it studied, mimicked, and diluted threats until they became another story whispered in bars, another cautionary tale stripped of teeth. Bane would not be remembered as a force of change if Roanapur succeeded. He would become folklore, his philosophy flattened into myth. He would not allow that erosion. Bane shifted tactics, abandoning overt interventions in favor of controlled pressure. He began targeting systems rather than people, dismantling logistics chains that allowed Roanapur's most entrenched powers to operate invisibly. Arms shipments vanished without explosions. Money transfers rerouted into dead accounts. Safe houses were compromised without a single shot fired, their occupants finding themselves exposed not to enemies, but to rivals they had trusted for years. This kind of disruption bred a different fear. Violence could be confronted. Uncertainty could not. The city's syndicates responded with internal purges, convinced that betrayal rather than external force was the cause. Paranoia spread faster than Bane ever could, doing his work for him. Entire crews vanished, not because Bane attacked them, but because their leaders no longer trusted them. Roanapur's strength, its reliance on personal loyalty and reputation, became its weakness. At the same time, Bane began observing Lagoon Company more closely. Unlike the syndicates, Dutch's operation did not panic. It adjusted calmly, efficiently, as if disruption was an old companion rather than a new threat. Routes changed. Jobs were vetted more aggressively. Rock's involvement in negotiations increased, suggesting a strategic pivot toward information over firepower. Revy, however, became restless, sensing an enemy she could not shoot. Bane respected that. Lagoon Company was not powerful in the traditional sense. They did not command armies or territory, but they were adaptable, and adaptability was the most valuable currency in Roanapur's evolving landscape. Bane did not intend to recruit them, nor eliminate them. He wanted to see how they reacted when the city itself began to fracture under ideological strain. That strain intensified when Bane made his next move. He targeted an institution no one questioned: the black market arbitration networks. These informal systems resolved disputes quietly, preventing wars by assigning blame, compensation, or sanctioned retaliation. They were the closest thing Roanapur had to governance. By destabilizing them, Bane struck at the city's hidden spine. Arbitrators began disappearing. Some fled. Others were found alive but ruined. Reputations shredded by leaks that revealed long-hidden manipulations. The trust that sustained arbitration collapsed. Disputes that would have ended with payouts now escalated into violence. The city's informal order began to unravel. This was not chaos for chaos's sake. Bane was forcing Roanapur to confront the cost of its own compromises. The city had convinced itself that exploitation was manageable if regulated. Bane rejected that premise entirely. The backlash was immediate and fierce. A new coalition emerged, distinct from the earlier failed attempt. This one was younger, leaner, less concerned with tradition. They did not seek to erase Bane symbolically. They wanted to outthink him. Their approach was decentralized, mirroring Bane's own methods. They spread disinformation, staged false operations, attempted to bait him into overextension. For the first time since arriving, Bane faced opponents who understood him. The contest that followed was quieter, but no less brutal. Each side probed for weaknesses. Each maneuver forced adaptation. Bane allowed some operations to succeed, not out of mercy, but to map the coalition's structure. He learned who made decisions, who executed them, and who merely followed. Patterns emerged. He prepared accordingly. Meanwhile, Roanapur's civilians felt the consequences most acutely. Markets fluctuated unpredictably. Protection arrangements dissolved. Violence became less frequent but more precise, its absence more unsettling than its presence. People began asking questions they had never dared voice before. Who benefits from this city? Who pays the price? And what happens if someone truly tries to change it? Bane watched these conversations with interest. Change did not begin with force. It began with doubt. Yet doubt alone was insufficient. Roanapur's inertia was immense, reinforced by generations who believed survival required moral surrender. To break that belief, Bane needed a moment that could not be reframed, a demonstration so decisive that the city could not mythologize it away. He found his opportunity in a weapons auction. The event was designed to reassert normalcy, a declaration that Roanapur's commerce continued unimpeded. Major players attended through proxies. Mercenary groups provided security. Lagoon Company was contracted for transport, a decision that did not escape Bane's notice. The auction symbolized everything he despised: efficiency without conscience, profit without accountability. Bane intervened decisively. He did not disrupt the auction violently. He exposed it. Data caches were released in real time, broadcasting transactions, client identities, and the eventual destinations of the weapons. Civilian militias, extremist cells, and regimes responsible for atrocities were named publicly. The city watched as its invisible economy became visible. The fallout was explosive. Clients fled. Security fractured. Syndicates accused one another of leaks. The auction collapsed, not in bloodshed, but in revelation. For the first time, Roanapur was forced to see itself as others did, stripped of plausible deniability. Bane's message was clear. This city survived by pretending consequences belonged elsewhere. He had brought them home. Lagoon Company barely escaped the chaos. Dutch understood immediately what had happened. Rock saw the broader implications. Revy only knew that someone had just declared war on the entire ecosystem they relied on. Their reactions were fractured, mirroring the city itself. In the days that followed, Roanapur teetered on the edge of transformation or annihilation. Some factions retreated, consolidating power and preparing for prolonged conflict. Others attempted reform, however superficial, hoping to placate a force they did not understand. A few reached out indirectly to Bane, seeking dialogue. He ignored them all. Bane was no longer reacting to Roanapur. He was shaping it. Each intervention stripped away another layer of illusion, forcing the city closer to a reckoning it could not avoid. The question was no longer whether Roanapur would change, but what it would become in the process. And beneath that question lurked a more dangerous one. How far was Bane willing to go if the city chose to resist transformation entirely? The answer would define the next stage of this war, not just for control, but for identity. Lagoon Company had survived Roanapur by understanding one immutable truth. The city did not reward loyalty, morality, or strength alone. It rewarded awareness. Dutch had learned long ago that Roanapur was less a battlefield and more a current. You didn't fight it head-on. You read it, adjusted your angle, and tried not to drown. But as the days passed after the auction collapse, Dutch felt something he hadn't felt in years. The current was changing direction. Jobs dried up in strange ways. Not fewer contracts, but fewer clear ones. Clients hesitated, asked too many questions, demanded guarantees no one in Roanapur could honestly give. Weapons shipments were postponed indefinitely. Data transfers replaced physical cargo. The city was pulling inward, reassessing itself, and that kind of introspection was dangerous. When Roanapur thought too much, it tended to explode. Rock noticed it too, though he framed it differently. Where Dutch saw instability, Rock saw narrative fracture. The stories people told themselves to justify survival were no longer aligning. Syndicates spoke of order while hoarding weapons. Reform-minded brokers whispered about restraint while hiring killers. Everyone claimed to be reacting defensively, yet every move felt preemptive. Someone was forcing them to confront contradictions they'd buried for years. Revy hated it. She prowled the city like a caged animal, spoiling for a fight that never came. Gunfights had rules. You saw your enemy. You pulled the trigger. You lived or you didn't. This new tension was invisible, omnipresent, and infuriating. Whoever was doing this wasn't just strong. They were messing with the rhythm of the city itself. When Revy finally snapped, it was inevitable. A routine pickup turned sour when a mid-level fixer tried to renegotiate payment after delivery, citing market uncertainty. Revy shot him in the leg before Dutch could stop her. Normally, that would have ended it. This time, it escalated. The fixer's men responded aggressively, not out of loyalty, but fear. Everyone was on edge. Everyone wanted to prove they weren't weak. The firefight was brief but loud. Bane watched it unfold from a distance. He had anticipated this exact reaction. Roanapur's violence was becoming reactive rather than transactional. That shift created mistakes, and mistakes revealed truths. He noted how quickly Lagoon Company extracted themselves, how Dutch prioritized survival over pride, how Rock attempted to de-escalate even as bullets flew, how Revy leaned into chaos as if daring it to swallow her whole. They were not aligned internally. That made them honest. Later that night, Bane made his first indirect contact. Rock found the message waiting for him in a cafe they used for low-risk meetings. No envelope, no digital trace. Just a handwritten note slipped beneath his coffee cup when he wasn't looking. It contained a single sentence. Roanapur believes chaos protects it. You know better. Rock felt a chill that had nothing to do with fear. The message wasn't a threat. It wasn't even a demand. It was an observation, and one that cut dangerously close to thoughts he'd never voiced aloud. He didn't tell Dutch immediately. He needed time to understand what accepting or rejecting that statement might mean. By the time Rock returned to the boat, Roanapur was already reacting again. Hotel Moscow moved next. Balalaika had tolerated Bane's disruptions with cold patience, but the auction incident crossed a line. It had exposed networks she considered essential, not because they were moral, but because they were controlled. Chaos she could plan for. Exposure she could not. Worse, Bane's actions had emboldened lesser factions to test boundaries they would never have approached before. This was not acceptable. Balalaika ordered a comprehensive intelligence sweep. Not an assassination. Not yet. She wanted to understand Bane's philosophy, his endgame, and whether his vision could coexist with her own. What she found disturbed her. Bane wasn't consolidating territory. He wasn't amassing wealth. He wasn't building a personal army. Everything pointed toward systemic disruption rather than conquest. That made him unpredictable. Balalaika respected strength, but she feared ideology. Ideology turned wars into crusades, and crusades had no off switch. She began positioning Hotel Moscow defensively, securing assets, relocating key personnel, preparing for a prolonged confrontation that might never involve a single direct battle. Meanwhile, the younger coalition that had tried to outmaneuver Bane splintered. Some members disappeared. Others defected. A few were found alive, broken psychologically rather than physically, convinced that resisting Bane was pointless because he wasn't playing the same game. Their warnings went largely ignored. Roanapur's smaller players felt the pressure most intensely. Without arbitration networks or predictable violence, survival became a guessing game. Some fled the city entirely. Others attempted to ingratiate themselves with emerging power brokers, offering information, loyalty, or blood. Bane accepted none of it. He neither rewarded nor punished these overtures. That silence was worse than rejection. The city began to mythologize him again, but this time the stories were darker. He was no longer just a man. He was an idea, a force that punished greed selectively and unpredictably. Some claimed he spared civilians intentionally. Others insisted he was laying groundwork for mass slaughter. The lack of clarity fed paranoia, and paranoia drove poor decisions. One of those decisions brought Bane and Revy into direct collision. A mercenary group, desperate to reassert relevance, attempted to bait Bane by staging a massacre designed to provoke his intervention. They miscalculated. Bane did intervene, but not alone. Revy arrived independently, drawn by the promise of a real fight and the chance to face the ghost everyone whispered about. The clash was brutal and chaotic. Revy tore through mercenaries with her usual ferocity, twin guns roaring, laughter sharp and unhinged. Bane moved differently, efficient, controlled. Each strike removed an opponent from the equation permanently or rendered them incapable of further violence. They did not coordinate. They did not acknowledge each other. Yet their actions intertwined, dismantling the mercenary force in minutes. When it was over, the silence between them was heavier than gunfire. Revy saw him clearly for the first time. Not a legend, not a shadow. A man built like a war machine, eyes calm, posture relaxed despite the carnage. He did not threaten her. He did not praise her. He simply assessed her, the way one predator evaluates another. You fight for release, Bane said calmly. Not purpose. Revy raised her guns without hesitation. You talk too much. Bane didn't flinch. So does Roanapur. That is why it is afraid. They parted without a shot fired between them, but the encounter reverberated through the city. Word spread quickly. Bane was real. He could fight. He could survive Revy. That alone elevated him into a new category of threat. Lagoon Company argued fiercely that night. Revy wanted blood. Dutch wanted distance. Rock wanted answers. None of them realized that by debating their response, they had already become entangled in Bane's experiment. Because Roanapur was no longer deciding whether to accept or reject him. It was deciding which parts of itself it was willing to sacrifice to stop him. And that decision would not come cheaply. Roanapur did not change overnight. It eroded. The city had always functioned on unspoken agreements. Violence was currency, reputation was law, and fear was manageable, so long as it remained evenly distributed. Bane's presence disrupted that equilibrium in a way no warlord or syndicate ever had. He was not hoarding fear. He was redistributing it, targeting the assumptions that kept Roanapur stable. The result was not chaos in the traditional sense. It was hesitation, and hesitation in Roanapur was lethal. Smaller syndicates began making irrational moves. Deals were broken mid-negotiation. Assassinations were ordered without confirmation. Entire crews went underground for weeks, resurfacing only when starvation or paranoia forced them back into the open. The city's rhythm slowed, then stuttered, like a machine missing critical gears. Gunfire still echoed at night, but it was uneven, uncoordinated. Violence, without confidence, lacked artistry, and Roanapur noticed. Bane noticed more. He observed patterns emerging from the instability, mapping psychological responses rather than territory. Who doubled down when threatened? Who froze? Who sought alliances? Who attempted reform? Every reaction told him something about the city's internal hierarchy, one that money and weapons alone did not reveal. Roanapur was a living organism, and like any organism under stress, it was exposing weaknesses. Hotel Moscow's response became increasingly visible. Balalaika's men established heavier patrols, not to provoke conflict, but to signal presence. Convoys moved with precision. Meetings were relocated to hardened locations. Communication channels were compartmentalized. She was building a shell, turning her organization inward, insulating it from ideological contamination. To Balalaika, Bane was not merely a threat. He was a destabilizing philosophy, and philosophies spread faster than bullets. Yet even Balalaika could not seal herself off entirely. Several of her subordinates began questioning orders, not openly, but subtly. Why certain targets were protected, why others were expendable. Why Hotel Moscow upheld some rules, but violated others when convenient. These questions were dangerous, not because they undermined authority, but because they were valid. Balalaika crushed dissent swiftly, But suppression did not erase thought. It only drove it deeper. Meanwhile, Lagoon Company found themselves drawn into situations they had not sought. Rock became an unwilling node in Roanapur's shifting consciousness. Fixers spoke more openly around him now, testing ideas they would never have voiced before. They asked hypothetical questions. What would Roanapur look like with fewer syndicates? Whether violence could be regulated instead of exploited. Whether someone like Bane was inevitable, a symptom rather than a cause. Rock listened, and that frightened him. He had always believed himself an observer, a mediator passing through a morally broken world without belonging to it. Now, people were treating him like a mirror. They saw their doubts reflected in his silence, his questions, his refusal to simplify. Bane's message haunted him, not because it was threatening, but because it validated thoughts Rock had buried under pragmatism. Dutch sensed Rock drifting and didn't like it. Dutch had survived wars by understanding one truth. You don't argue with reality, you adapt to it. Bane was changing the operational reality of Roanapur, and Dutch's instincts screamed that they needed to disengage completely. Take fewer jobs. Avoid flashpoints. Ride out the storm. But Rock wasn't content with survival alone anymore, and Revy was actively seeking confrontation. Lagoon Company was fracturing under pressures it had never faced before. Revy, for her part, felt insulted. Bane had walked away from her, not out of fear, but indifference. That cut deeper than any bullet. She prowled Roanapur aggressively, dismantling mercenary crews, provoking syndicate enforcers, daring the city to react. Each fight was an attempt to force Bane's hand, to drag him into a clash where violence was honest and immediate. But Bane did not respond. Instead, the city responded. Revy's actions triggered retaliations that didn't target her directly. Safe houses were burned. Informants vanished. Deals Lagoon Company depended on were quietly rerouted. It was punishment by proxy, and it infuriated her. Violence had rules. This was manipulation, and it made her feel powerless in a way she despised. Bane observed this too. He understood Revy well enough to know that denying her direct conflict was more effective than defeating her. She was a creature of momentum, and he was starving her of it. Each indirect consequence pushed her closer to a breaking point, forcing her to confront emotions she usually drowned in gunfire. Anger, confusion, a gnawing sense that she was being used without consent. Roanapur's civilians began to feel the pressure next. Markets closed early. Dock workers refused certain shipments. Entire neighborhoods locked down after dark. Fear spread not because of increased violence, but because of uncertainty. No one knew which rules still applied. No one knew who was untouchable anymore. In a city where predictability was the closest thing to safety, unpredictability became terror. Rumors surfaced that Bane was testing something larger, though no one could articulate what. Some believed he was building toward a mass purge. Others thought he intended to leave once Roanapur had proven its point. The lack of clarity fractured consensus, and fractured consensus destroyed collective action. The city could not unite against him because it could not agree on what he was. That ambiguity was deliberate. Bane finally made his second direct move, and it was not violent. A meeting was arranged between rival syndicates who had been at war for years. Neutral ground. No weapons. No threats. The invitation made it clear that attendance was optional, but absence would be noted. Against their better judgment, most attended, driven by curiosity, fear, or desperation. Roanapur had never seen enemies sit in the same room without guns. Bane spoke briefly. He did not demand loyalty. He did not threaten annihilation. He outlined the city's inefficiencies with surgical precision, redundant conflicts, cycles of revenge that yielded no profit, power structures that consumed their own resources to preserve ego. He offered nothing resembling peace, only sustainability. A Roanapur that could function without devouring itself every decade. Some laughed. Some listened. All remembered. The meeting ended without agreement, but it marked a turning point. Bane was no longer operating in the shadows. He was challenging Roanapur's identity openly, forcing its leaders to justify their existence beyond tradition and fear. That was a provocation far greater than any assassination. Balalaika recognized the danger immediately. She ordered contingency plans accelerated. If Bane's ideas took root, brute force would not be enough to erase them. She began considering alliances she despised and sacrifices she would have previously deemed unacceptable. Survival now required adaptation at a philosophical level, and Balalaika hated battles she could not win with artillery. Lagoon Company stood at a crossroads. Dutch prepared exit strategies. Rock prepared arguments. Revy prepared for war. None of them yet understood that Roanapur was approaching a point of no return. The city could not go back to what it was before Bane. Even if he vanished tomorrow, the questions he raised would remain, festering beneath the surface, waiting for another catalyst. Bane knew this. He had not come to rule Roanapur. He had come to prove that it could not survive unchanged. And in doing so, he had turned the city against itself, not with bombs or armies, but with the unbearable weight of self-awareness. Roanapur did not explode. It reorganized. The days following the Syndicate summit felt deceptively calm. Violence did not spike. Bodies did not pile up in the streets. Instead, the city entered a phase of controlled tension, like a muscle held too long in a clenched state. Everyone was waiting for something, but no one agreed on what that something was. That uncertainty altered behavior more profoundly than any gunfight ever had. Alliances began forming quietly, without ceremony or announcement. Old enemies started sharing information through intermediaries. Shipping routes once contested with blood were suddenly being divided with spreadsheets and whispered agreements. Not out of trust, but mutual exhaustion. The realization had settled in that fighting each other while Bane reshaped the city was suicidal. Roanapur's power brokers had not become enlightened. They had become pragmatic. Bane had forced a recalculation. He did not interfere with these alliances. He allowed them to form organically, knowing full well that alliances born of fear were inherently unstable. His interest was not in whether they held, but in what they revealed. Who compromised first? Who demanded dominance? Who insisted on being indispensable? Every coalition exposed internal hierarchies and personal insecurities, and Bane absorbed that information patiently. Hotel Moscow adapted faster than most. Balalaika formalized her partnerships with military precision. She approached cooperation as logistics, not ideology. Resources were pooled. Intelligence was standardized. Response protocols were aligned. To her, this was not capitulation to Bane's influence, but an assertion of control. If Roanapur was going to change, she intended to shape the change rather than be consumed by it. Yet even within Hotel Moscow, fractures widened. Veteran soldiers followed orders, but younger operatives questioned strategy in ways that bordered on philosophical dissent. They had joined a criminal syndicate to escape purposeless warfare, not to participate in another grand experiment about power structures. Bane's rhetoric, stripped of theatrics, resonated uncomfortably with their own disillusionment. Balalaika noticed the shift and responded with discipline. But discipline could not erase doubt once it had been articulated. The Triad took a different approach. They leaned into tradition, doubling down on symbolism, ritual, and hierarchy. Meetings became more formal. Punishments more ceremonial. Loyalty was emphasized publicly, almost theatrically. This was not strength. It was insecurity disguised as confidence. Bane recognized it immediately. The louder an organization proclaimed unity, the more fragile it usually was. Smaller groups attempted to exploit the situation. Independent mercenary outfits rebranded themselves as neutral enforcers, selling protection to multiple sides simultaneously. Information brokers inflated their importance, trading rumors for inflated fees. A few charismatic opportunists attempted to position themselves as ideological leaders, parroting fragments of Bane's philosophy without understanding it. Most of them died quickly, eliminated not by Bane, but by the city's immune response to incompetence. Lagoon Company drifted dangerously close to becoming an access point. Dutch's neutrality made him valuable. Rock's intellect made him influential. Revy's reputation made them untouchable in certain circles. People began approaching them not just for transport or firepower, but for perspective. Where does Lagoon Company stand? Who are you backing? What happens if this all collapses? Dutch refused to answer. Rock couldn't stop thinking about it. Revy despised the question. Rock found himself increasingly at odds with Dutch. Dutch saw alliances as temporary tools, necessary but dangerous. Rock saw them as inevitable evolutions, a chance for Roanapur to become something less self-destructive. Their arguments were quiet, civil, and deeply unresolved. Neither man was wrong. That was the problem. Revy, meanwhile, felt caged. The city was becoming strategic, cautious, slow. Everything she hated. Violence had become a bargaining chip rather than an expression. She was a weapon being sheathed when not immediately useful, and that offended her sense of identity. She wanted the city to choose, to fight, to break, to reveal its true nature in gunfire and screams. Bane continued to deny her that release. Instead, he shifted focus. His next move targeted Roanapur's infrastructure. Ports began experiencing accidents. Not explosions, but malfunctions. Cranes locked mid-operation. Power grids failed selectively. Communication blackouts occurred in precise windows. Each incident was reversible, temporary, and devastatingly inconvenient. Trade slowed. Profits dipped. Tensions flared. The city felt fragile in a way it never had before. No one could trace these disruptions back to Bane conclusively. That uncertainty was worse than confirmation. Syndicates accused each other. Alliances strained. Paranoia spiked. Bane had introduced a new variable into Roanapur's equation: systemic vulnerability. The realization that the city's lifelines could be manipulated without firing a single shot terrified its leaders more than any rival ever had. Balalaika convened emergency councils. She did not ask whether Bane could be eliminated. She asked what would happen if he couldn't. The question reframed everything. Contingency planning expanded beyond assassination scenarios into long-term survival strategies. What does Roanapur look like if Bane remains a permanent factor? How does one govern chaos without appearing to govern it? The city began to resemble a Cold War zone. Lines were drawn, but rarely crossed. Threats were implied rather than stated. Moves were countered before they fully materialized. Everyone was watching everyone else, waiting for the first major misstep. Violence became precise, almost surgical, because excess now carried consequences that rippled unpredictably. Bane finally addressed the city again, indirectly. A series of documents surfaced across Roanapur's underworld networks. Analyses, projections, cold assessments of how long each major syndicate could survive under current conditions. No demands, no signatures, just numbers, probabilities, and outcomes. It was not propaganda. It was accounting. The impact was devastating. Leaders saw their organizations reduced to data points. Lifespans quantified. Weaknesses exposed. Pride evaporated in the face of statistical inevitability. Some dismissed the documents as psychological warfare. Others privately verified the numbers and found them disturbingly accurate. The city's alliances began shifting again, not toward unity, but toward consolidation, mergers, absorptions, silent takeovers. Power was concentrating not out of ambition, but survival instinct. Bane had accelerated Roanapur's evolution, compressing decades of violent entropy into months of strategic realignment. Lagoon Company was forced to choose. A major coalition approached Dutch with an offer that was impossible to ignore: protection, resources, stability. In exchange, Lagoon Company would serve as intermediaries, facilitators, and, when necessary, enforcers. Not soldiers, but architects of movement. Dutch saw the trap immediately. Rock saw the opportunity. Revy saw the coming bloodshed. The argument that followed was the most serious the company had ever faced. It was not about money. It was about identity, about whether they remained outsiders surviving the city, or became participants shaping it. Bane had engineered the situation without ever speaking to them directly. He had turned their neutrality into a liability. Roanapur hovered on the edge of transformation. The city had not yet chosen whether it would resist Bane's influence, absorb it, or collapse under the strain of adaptation. But one truth had become undeniable. The old Roanapur, ruled by predictable violence and rigid hierarchies, was dying. What replaced it would be something leaner, colder, and far more dangerous. And Bane was still watching, waiting for the moment when the city would finally show him what it deserved to become. The first true collapse did not come with gunfire. It came with silence. For 6 hours, Roanapur's eastern docks went completely dark. No power. No communications. No alarms. Ships drifted untethered in the harbor like dead animals. The blackout did not spread. It did not flicker. It simply existed, contained and absolute, as though a piece of the city had been removed from reality and then stitched back in place when the lights returned. By the time power was restored, everyone understood the message. Bane was done demonstrating influence. He was now enforcing consequences. The docks were the city's bloodstream. Nearly half of Roanapur's illicit economy flowed through those piers. Weapons, narcotics, trafficked humans, laundered funds, rare tech. 6 hours of disruption meant millions lost, deals broken, trust shattered. More importantly, it proved that no alliance, no syndicate, no military background could protect the city's core systems. Balalaika did not convene a council this time. She called for something far more dangerous. She summoned the city's first genuine convergence meeting. It took place in a warehouse stripped of markings and symbolism. No flags. No uniforms. No visible weapons beyond sidearms. Representatives arrived under heavy secrecy, escorted by neutral intermediaries. The Triads sent elders. Smaller gangs sent envoys. Mercenary captains appeared reluctantly. Even unaffiliated power brokers showed up, sensing that absence now carried risk. The topic was simple and terrifying. What would it cost to remove Bane? Not whether it was possible. What it would cost. The discussion fractured immediately. Some argued assassination was still viable. Bane was human. Humans died. All it would take was the right sniper, the right bomb, the right betrayal. Others countered that every attempt so far had failed not because of luck, but because Bane understood Roanapur better than they did. Killing him might ignite chaos, far worse than his continued presence. Then came the harder realization. Even if Bane were eliminated, the systems he had set in motion would not stop. Alliances had shifted. Power had consolidated. Infrastructure dependencies had been exposed. The city could not return to what it was without tearing itself apart. Bane was no longer just a man. He was a catalyst whose effects had already propagated beyond his physical reach. The meeting reached a deadlock. Until Rock spoke. He was not the most powerful person in the room. He was not the most dangerous. But he had something the others lacked. Perspective. He framed the problem not as a war, but as an equation. Bane had created a feedback loop. Fear drove consolidation. Consolidation increased systemic fragility. Fragility made the city more vulnerable to manipulation. Attacking Bane directly would accelerate that loop into collapse. Ignoring him would allow him to continue refining it. The only viable option was disruption without destruction. They would have to outgrow him. The idea was radical and deeply offensive to Roanapur's identity. Outgrowing a threat meant changing behavior, not overpowering it. It meant decentralizing selectively, diversifying infrastructure, reducing single points of failure. It meant refusing to react predictably. It meant cooperation without allegiance, coordination without hierarchy. It meant sacrifice. Profit margins would shrink. Turf would be shared. Some long-held advantages would be surrendered voluntarily, not out of morality, but necessity. A system too complex to control was also too complex to dominate. The resistance was immediate. No one wanted to be the first to give something up. No one trusted others to follow through. The room filled with suspicion, old grudges resurfacing. The idea teetered on the edge of collapse. Balalaika intervened. She did not appeal to trust. She appealed to inevitability. She presented her own numbers. Cold projections. Scenarios where Bane was removed. Scenarios where he stayed. Scenarios where the city adapted. In every model where Roanapur refused to change, it died. Slowly or violently, but completely. In the few models where it survived, it did so by becoming something unrecognizable. The cost of reversal was not measured in blood. It was measured in identity. The meeting ended without agreement. But something had shifted. The idea lingered. In the days that followed, subtle changes began appearing across the city. Not coordinated, not announced, but real. Redundant supply routes were established quietly. Independent power generators appeared in unlikely places. Information networks diversified. A few syndicates deliberately allowed smaller rivals to survive instead of crushing them, creating buffers rather than monopolies. Bane noticed immediately. He did not stop it. Instead, he accelerated pressure. A second blackout struck, this time targeting financial systems. Ledgers corrupted, accounts frozen, debts erased or multiplied seemingly at random. The chaos forced emergency negotiations, rapid improvisation, and exposed which organizations had prepared contingencies and which had not. Those that adapted survived. Those that clung to old structures bled. Lagoon Company found itself in the center of the storm. Dutch had begun quietly implementing Rock's framework without labeling it as such. Redundant contacts, flexible routing, shared intelligence without formal alliances. Revy hated it. It felt like caution masquerading as strategy. But she could not deny its effectiveness. They were insulated from the worst disruptions, not because they were powerful, but because they were adaptable. Rock, however, was unraveling. The weight of influence pressed on him in ways he had never experienced. People listened to him now, not because they liked him, but because he had been right. That responsibility terrified him. Every suggestion carried consequences measured in lives and livelihoods. He was no longer reacting to chaos. He was shaping it. Bane finally approached him directly, not with a threat, with a conversation. They met in a nondescript cafe during off hours. No guards, no theatrics, just two men sitting across from each other, the city humming uneasily around them. Bane spoke calmly, acknowledging Rock's contributions, praising his clarity of thought. Then he asked the question that mattered. How far are you willing to let the city change? Rock did not answer immediately, because he understood the trap. If Roanapur became resilient enough, Bane's leverage would diminish. But that resilience would come at the cost of everything the city had been built on. Violence would no longer be the primary currency. Fear would lose its efficiency. Power would diffuse into systems rather than individuals. Roanapur would survive, but it would no longer be Roanapur. Rock asked Bane why he was doing this. Bane's answer was simple. Because cities like this always destroy themselves. He was merely accelerating the process to see whether anything worth saving emerged. If it did, it would be stronger for it. If not, then its destruction was inevitable anyway. The conversation ended without resolution. But Rock left knowing something crucial. Bane was not invested in winning. He was invested in outcomes. The city's final gamble began soon after. A coalition of factions enacted a coordinated shift. Not an attack, a refusal. They stopped responding to certain pressures, allowed minor losses, absorbed disruptions without retaliation. The city's behavior changed in ways that broke predictive models. Bane's influence began to weaken, not vanish, but blur. His manipulations relied on expectation, on fear-driven responses, on predictable greed. When those variables softened, his control became less precise. still formidable, but no longer absolute. The cost was immense. Profits dropped. Some leaders were overthrown internally for perceived weakness. Violence flared in pockets where old instincts refused to die. Innocence suffered. There was no clean path forward. But Roanapur did not collapse. It bent. And in bending, it began to slip from Bane's grasp. The city had chosen survival over dominance. Whether that choice would hold was uncertain. But for the first time since Bane's arrival, Roanapur was no longer merely reacting. It was deciding. And that decision would determine not just whether Bane could be stopped, but whether the city deserved to continue existing at all. Bane did not respond to Roanapur's defiance with anger. He responded with escalation. The city's refusal to collapse cleanly offended not his ego, but his hypothesis. Roanapur was not behaving as predicted. Its systems were degrading unevenly, adapting faster than expected, redistributing power in ways that resisted centralization. That outcome was unacceptable, not because it threatened Bane, but because it challenged the conclusion he had already drawn about cities like this. So he changed the parameters. The next phase was not infrastructural. It was psychological. Rumors began circulating with unnatural precision. Not wild conspiracy, but carefully engineered truths. Secrets surfaced at exactly the wrong moments. Evidence of betrayal leaked just before alliances finalized. Financial discrepancies appeared that suggested internal sabotage rather than external interference. Trust eroded, not through overt manipulation, but through revelation. Bane weaponized honesty. Roanapur had survived on lies, on plausible deniability, on not knowing too much. By exposing buried truths, he forced factions to confront realities they had long avoided. Old crimes resurfaced. Hidden power plays were dragged into the light. The city turned inward, dissecting itself. Balalaika felt the shift immediately. Hotel Moscow's internal cohesion began to strain under revelations about past decisions she had made unilaterally. Operations justified by necessity now looked like calculated sacrifices. Soldiers who had followed her unquestioningly began re-evaluating loyalty. Discipline held, but respect fractured. Balalaika did not deny the truth. She owned it. That choice preserved her command, but at a cost. She was no longer mythologized. She was human, fallible. That vulnerability stabilized Hotel Moscow, even as it weakened her personal authority. A paradox Bane had anticipated, but not fully accounted for. The Triad fared worse. Centuries of ritual could not withstand exposure. Internal betrayals ignited power struggles that tradition could not contain. Elders turned on one another. Younger members seized opportunity. The organization hemorrhaged influence, not through violence, but fragmentation. Roanapur's underworld became a hall of mirrors. No one trusted appearances. Every gesture was analyzed for hidden intent. Every alliance felt temporary. Paranoia replaced fear as the city's dominant emotion, and paranoia was far more corrosive. Lagoon Company stood at the edge of implosion. Rock's role as an informal strategist became public knowledge. His name surfaced in leaked communications. His ideas were traced back to adaptive shifts that had cost certain syndicates money and power. Some began viewing him as a liability, others as a potential kingmaker. Revy saw him as a target waiting to happen. Dutch tried to pull them back into obscurity. It was too late. Bane had marked Rock deliberately, not for elimination, for elevation. The message was clear. If Roanapur wanted a counterweight to his influence, it would need a focal point. Someone to project coherence without control. Someone whose power came from ideas rather than fear. Rock did not want that role. That made him perfect. The city's tensions peaked when Bane made his boldest move. He reappeared publicly, not in secret meetings, not through intermediaries. He announced a gathering at a neutral site and invited every major power broker in Roanapur to attend. No threats, no ultimatums, just an invitation. The audacity stunned the city. Everyone knew it was a trap. No one could afford not to go. The gathering took place in an abandoned shipyard, stripped to bare concrete and steel. No cover. No shadows. Attendees arrived armed, tense, suspicious. Snipers watched from a distance. Contingency plans overlapped chaotically. The air vibrated with anticipation. Bane arrived alone. He did not speak at first. He walked the length of the assembled crowd, meeting eyes, observing reactions. He let silence do the work. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm, unamplified, yet it carried. He acknowledged the city's adaptation. He praised its resilience. Then he delivered his thesis. Roanapur, as it existed, was unsustainable. Its survival depended on continuous violence, exploitation, and entropy. The recent shift had delayed collapse, but not eliminated it. The systems built on criminality could not stabilize indefinitely. The city was simply choosing a slower death. Unless he proposed an alternative, a controlled convergence, a restructuring of power that formalized what had already begun. Centralized oversight without centralized rule. Transparent violence. Regulated chaos. A framework that transformed Roanapur from a predatory ecosystem into a managed one. He did not position himself as ruler. He positioned himself as architect. The reaction was immediate and volatile. Some laughed. Others shouted. A few listened. Balalaika's response was measured. She challenged his assumption that control could ever be neutral, that oversight would inevitably become domination, that his framework, no matter how elegant, placed too much power in the hands of those designing it. Bane agreed. That was the risk. Then he revealed his final move. He had already begun implementing the framework through proxies, data sharing systems, conflict arbitration mechanisms, resource allocation protocols, pieces of a structure that could either be co-opted by the city or left to operate autonomously. If Roanapur rejected him, the system would continue without oversight. Chaos, but efficient chaos. If they accepted, they could shape it. The choice was not between Bane and freedom. It was between influence and irrelevance. The confrontation reached its breaking point when Rock spoke. He did not argue ideology. He questioned premise. Roanapur did not need to be sustainable. It needed to be survivable. There was a difference. Systems that aimed for stability invited stagnation. Systems that aimed for adaptability remained alive. Bane's framework solved for order, not resilience. The silence that followed was absolute. Bane considered this. Then, for the first time, he smiled. Not in mockery. In recognition. He admitted Rock was right. And then he did the unthinkable. He stepped back. Not physically. Strategically. He dismantled parts of his own framework in real time, handing control of key nodes to the city's factions without condition. It was not surrender. It was escalation in a different direction. A final test. Could Roanapur govern itself without collapsing into tyranny or anarchy? The answer was uncertain, but the moment marked a turning point. Bane had pushed the city to the edge of reinvention. Now it would either redefine power on its own terms or prove him right by destroying itself. The war for Roanapur's soul had reached its climax. Not with bullets, but with choices. And every choice would echo long after Bane was gone. Roanapur did not explode. That alone felt unnatural. In the hours following the shipyard gathering, every analyst, every mercenary tactician, every survivor who understood the city's rhythms expected blood. Power vacuums in Roanapur had always been filled violently. The absence of immediate catastrophe unsettled people more than chaos ever had. It meant something had changed at a fundamental level. Bane vanished again. No announcements. No parting threat. No declaration of victory or failure. Surveillance networks searched for him obsessively and found nothing. It was as if he had never been there at all, except for the systems he left behind and the psychological scars etched into the city's decision-making. The framework he had seeded did not activate as a singular machine. It behaved like a nervous system, fragmented, adaptive, imperfect. Data flowed unevenly. Arbitration channels were used cautiously at first, then selectively. No faction trusted it entirely, but each found it useful enough not to destroy. That was the danger. And the opportunity. Balalaika moved first, not with force, but with policy. Hotel Moscow began using the framework openly, formalizing its operations just enough to appear legitimate, without sacrificing lethality. Contracts became clearer. Reprisals became more precise. Violence, once theatrical, became surgical. Her soldiers did not like it, but they respected the efficiency. She did not become weaker. She became harder to predict. The Triads splintered further, but from the wreckage emerged smaller, more agile cells that exploited the framework better than their predecessors. Tradition died screaming, but adaptability thrived. Roanapur did not mourn the old Triad. It absorbed what remained useful and discarded the rest. Dutch took Lagoon Company underground again, but not into obscurity. He leveraged Rock's unwanted prominence to negotiate safer corridors, cleaner deals, fewer ambushes. Lagoon Company became intermediaries rather than predators. That role came with risk, but it also came with longevity. Revy hated it. Until she didn't. The fights became rarer, but deadlier. When violence happened now, it meant something. Revy found a brutal satisfaction in that clarity. Killing had purpose again, not just momentum. Rock struggled the most. People came to him for answers he did not want to give. They assumed intent where there had only been reaction. They saw design where there had been desperation. The city began treating him as a stabilizing force, a human algorithm balancing interests without bloodshed. Rock knew better. He was not in control. He was a symptom. And that knowledge haunted him. Because Bane had been right about one thing. Roanapur could not remain what it was and survive indefinitely. But Bane had been wrong about something else. Survival did not require domination. It required restraint. Months passed. The city did not become safer. It became quieter. Deals replaced shootouts. Assassinations became rarer but more consequential. The weak still died, but fewer died by accident. Roanapur evolved into something colder, sharper, more deliberate. A thinking predator. Bane's influence faded into myth. Some claimed he had been a mercenary philosopher. Others believed he was a myth engineered to justify change. A few whispered that he watched from afar, measuring outcomes, waiting to see if the city validated his conclusions. No proof ever surfaced. What remained undeniable was the shift he triggered. Power in Roanapur was no longer purely physical. Information mattered more than guns. Timing mattered more than fear. Reputation became currency again, but this time it was backed by verifiable consequence. The city learned to remember. That memory altered behavior. And in that alteration, Roanapur crossed a threshold. Not into order, not into peace, but into continuity. The city would not collapse tomorrow, or next year, or even in a decade. It would persist scarred, dangerous, alive. No longer a fluke of lawlessness, but a self-sustaining anomaly. A city that had stared down a force designed to break civilizations and chosen, imperfectly, to adapt instead. Rock stood on the docks one evening, watching ships come and go, feeling the weight of decisions he never consented to making. He wondered if Bane would approve of the outcome. Then he realized something unsettling. It didn't matter. For the first time in its violent history, Roanapur's future did not hinge on a single man's will. Not Bane's. Not Balalaika's. Not his own. It hinged on a fragile, shared understanding that control was a poison best administered sparingly. Roanapur remained hell. But it was a hell that learned. And that made it dangerous in ways no outsider would ever fully comprehend. The city had not been conquered. It had been tested, and it had survived. Bane never ruled Roanapur, and that was the truth most people missed when they tried to tell the story later. He did not plant a flag, crown himself king, or crush the city beneath his heel. What he did was far more insidious and far more lasting. He forced Roanapur to look at itself without the comforting illusion that chaos was freedom or that violence was destiny. He exposed the city's greatest lie, that it survived because it was ruthless, when in reality it survived because it adapted faster than anything sent to destroy it. Roanapur did not reject Bane because it was moral. It rejected him because it was intelligent. The city absorbed his pressure, tested his logic, and kept only what served its own continuity. His systems were stripped of absolutism. His philosophy was diluted by human unpredictability. What remained was not order, but structure. Not peace, but intention. Roanapur did not become better. It became sharper. That distinction mattered. Balalaika retained her power, but learned that fear alone was inefficient. Dutch preserved his neutrality, but accepted that survival required engagement, not distance. Revy found that violence, when restrained, carried more meaning. Rock learned the hardest lesson of all, that influence does not require authority, and that choosing not to rule does not absolve one of responsibility. And Bane? If he watched from afar, he would have seen something both validating and infuriating. His belief that systems outlast individuals proved correct. His assumption that dominance was the only path to stability did not. Roanapur stabilized not through conquest, but through collective self-interest sharpened by near collapse. The city did not become Gotham. It became something worse and better at the same time. A place where morality was still negotiable, but consequences were no longer abstract. A city where power was distributed unevenly, but no longer blindly. A criminal ecosystem that remembered pain and adjusted accordingly. Roanapur remained a trap for the unwary, a graveyard for the naive, and a proving ground for the ruthless. But it was no longer a dead and spiraling toward inevitable implosion. It had learned to bend instead of break. In the end, the most dangerous legacy Bane left behind was not his strength or his intellect. It was the idea that even a city built on blood could evolve without surrendering its identity. That idea would linger far longer than any man ever could. And in a world like Roanapur, ideas were the deadliest weapons of all.